So this is based on an analysis which took the data from the British Social Attitudes Survey, we call it number 36, and it was data collected in 2018 and reported in 2019, and I call it new because I did the analysis in the middle of 2020. But the British Social Attitudes Survey is a really important set of data, very credible, very objective. And what's really important about it is that it's been running since 1983. So there's a very good long set of data. Every 10 years, it does, well, since the beginning of the 90s, it's done a deep dive on religion and belief, what they unfortunately call religion. And so they did one in 1998, they did one in 2008. And the reason I looked at this is because they did one in 2018. So this is really just taking stuff from that and from one or two other sources, which I thought you might be interested in. There's masses of data. You can get lost in all of this. So I just sort of picked out some things. Two routes really. One is they wrote a report about it, and I pulled out a number of slides and things from that report. And then I actually looked at some of the underlying data as well, looking at things that weren't actually in their report but were in the underlying data. So this is the title of the report they did. Now, the report, these are the highlights, and this is pretty much sort of cut and paste from what they said. Stuff that won't be a total surprise. Dramatic decline in identification with Christian denominations, particularly the C of E. Substantial increase in atheism and self-description as very or extremely non-religious. Very low confidence religious organizations, which is an interesting thing, but also tolerance of religious difference. So this is, and this report is by a couple of sociologists who, you know, have been, Steve Bruce in particular, Scottish sociologist, has been doing this work for decades. So these are really people very knowledgeable. And one of their other things was just looking at the data is just what's looking a bit behind that trend. And what they're basically saying is that there's a generational decline in institutional, what they call institutional religion. And as you can see for yourself here, if you've got two parents who are both, say, Anglican, then there's a 50% chance that you'll be an Anglican. But if you've got two parents who are both not religious, there's a very high chance that you'll be non-religious. And if you've only got one person who's an Anglican, then there's only a quarter of a chance. So basically they've translated that into saying institutional religion in Britain now has a half-life of one generation, half-life, a term used in radioactive decay. Okay. So this is a generational change, and that's important to hang on to, because this isn't saying that people the trend is because people are becoming less religious. That is happening, but not very much. It's not about individuals becoming less religious. It's about generations not being as religious as their parents. And this is a chart that I've been tracking. So this goes right back to the beginning of the British Social Attitudes Survey, 1983. And what you can see here is this blue line going down here is the Church of England. You can see it goes up and down quite a lot because the British Social Attitudes Survey is based on a sample. Samples always have errors in them. But the trend is absolutely clear. The mirror image of that is the red line, which is the no religion line. Now, what's important to note about this, and this is, by the way, what Humanists UK often quote, 52% of the population say they're not religious. What does that really mean, though? And what it means is how they answered a very specific question. Do you regard yourself as belonging to any particular religion? And if the person says, yes, I do, then there's a supplementary question. Here's a list of religions. Which one of those do you consider yourself as belonging to? Okay. So the question is not about belief. It's about identity. It's about how do you identify yourself. And that's an important thing to hang on to. So anyway, you can see this decline, and this is catastrophic decline. 40%, 1983, 12% now for the Church of England. And you can see similarly the green line here are the Catholics. They're dropping, but not as much. And the reason they're not dropping nearly as much is because a lot of immigration has been from Catholic countries, particularly from Poland. Okay, so they're dropping. But this dark red line is Christian no denomination. And that's a combination of a number of things. One is people who might say, well, I suppose I'm broadly identify as a Christian, but I don't particularly adhere to any particular denomination. Probably a small number of those people. There's people who, for nationalistic reasons, might say, you know, if you're Tommy Robinson, yes, I'm British and I'm Christian. But the thing that's driving the growth here really is people who are Christians, but aren't a member of any of the big denominations. So these are independent churches, new churches, Pentecostal churches, those sorts of things. And they've seen some growth in recent years. And what's significant is when you add all of those bits up, it's now bigger than the Church of England. The other thing the other line that's going up here, of course, is this light blue one at the bottom here. And that is the Muslim line. And not surprisingly that's going up. It's immigration driven, and a lot of people who identify with Islam are young people. So it's going up. And what you can see is it's still a very low number, you know, about 6%. But you can see, unless something dramatic happens, we will very soon have more people identify as Muslims than who identify as Catholics. So this is quite a big set of changes going on identity. And you can see these numbers I've just pulled out. Now, this is just even more stark point about the Church of England. Demographics. Question is, will that line you've just seen keep going in the direction it's going, downwards? And the answer is yes. So you can see that 33% of people who are over 75 identify as Anglican. When you get to 18 to 24-year-olds, it's 1%. 1%. That is a disaster for the Church of England. And you don't often see this number talked about. But it means that unless they can do something dramatic, this line is going to continue to go down, which has got all sorts of implications across, which maybe we can talk about. Something that might be a bit uncomfortable for us as humanists. Most humanists are very liberally minded people and things. There's a bit of an ethnic divide here. 80% of people who are non-white, in terms of their ethnicity, identify with a faith. Okay, but only 40% of people who are white identify with faith. So it's half. Really, really big difference. And there's a number of implications for that. One, of course, is from our point of view, it means that if you encounter somebody who is not white, who is a humanist, or whatever term they use, or maybe they say they're an atheist, then they probably had quite a difficult journey to get there. And they may feel, if you talk to people in the Black Black Humanist Association, they'll say, well, one of the difficulties is, you know, I found now it's quite difficult for me to do social events with my relatives because they're all very devout Christians, for instance. Okay, so there's an ethnic issue here. And you've also got to be a bit careful about looking at national data. And here are some figures for London, totally different from the national picture I've just pointed out. Although it's true that in London there are more non-religious people than any of these religious groupings, you can see that that it's only about a third of the population say that they're not religious, and the mix of religions differs as well. So the dark blue line is London, and you can see non-Christian religious is really big, and that's because there's lots of Muslims and Hindus in London. Okay? And Catholics are slightly more than Anglicans. So you've got to be very careful about generalization. So, you know, London, more religious, less Anglican, more Catholic, more non-traditional Christian, lots of Pentecostal, black African churches. Okay. And you can guess that you'd see similar things if you look at some other big cities. So again, be careful about generalization. Another thing that came out of the study was this question of age and gender. And I've already made the point that in general, individuals, it's often said that as you get older, you get more religious. That just isn't true. But it is true that more older people are religious, as we've seen earlier on. Okay, so that the idea that, oh yeah, Darwin can, you know, suddenly became very religious on his deathbed, that's complete rubbish. Or that idea that as you face your mortality, you get more religious, just isn't true. But more older people are religious. And the other thing is that there's a gender difference as well. On average, you've got to be very, very careful here about sweeping generalizations, but on average, women are more religious than men are. And that's true in every generation. That's what the data says. So to me, saying that you can't have, you know, women priests or something doesn't make sense, because actually, you know, that's the majority of your followers. Okay, now this looks a bit complicated. Don't worry, I'll talk you this through. Political identification is another thing that came out of the study. It used to be said that the Church of England was the Conservative Party at prayer. Not true. Well, it's certainly not true anymore. If you look on the left-hand side of the chart, this is the Church of England. These two are the Church of England, and you can see the political affiliations, and it's split by age. People 18 to 44 and people 45 or over. And you can see even if the older age group, about half the sample is identify as conservative. The younger age group, it's only just over a quarter. So, and you can see this pattern going through, if you look at Catholics, other types of Christians, non-Christians, and the non-religious. On balance, people may become more conservative as they get older. Don't know, but that's a fact we see all over the place. But it's not true that the Church of England is a Conservative Party at prayer. Catholics actually are slightly more Labour supporting. Other Christians, similar picture, and non-Christians even more so. Okay, so this is the political identity. There's not huge differences here. Now this one also, so we talked about political affiliation, and we talked, was all about identity. Now let's look at belief. So not saying how people identify themselves, but what they actually believe. And again, slightly baffling chart, so I'll talk you through it. Look first at the bottom, the deeper red color, or red. So this is looking across. What they did was, because they haven't released all of the data, by the way, so I have to do a bit picking and choosing here. Looking across the past 20 years. People who said, I don't believe in God. So that is people who are atheists. We've gone up from 1998, from 10% to 2018, the latest sample, which is getting on for 25 or 30%. So huge increase. Okay. Still a minority. The pink one, agnostic. I don't know whether there is a God, and I don't think there's any way to find out. Really, that hasn't changed very much. Okay. This one, the green one, I don't believe in a personal God, but I believe in some sort of higher power. Shrunk a little bit, but not dramatically. But this one, which is a more questioning one, I find myself believing in God some of the time, but not at others. That has got smaller. And this more questioning one, while I feel I have doubts, I feel that I do believe in God, has also got smaller. Whereas the certainty one, I know God really exists and I have no doubt about it, which is the opposite. This is a confirmed theist, is again pretty flat. So what you can see is that that has remained largely static. The number of people who are firm in their atheism has gone up, and what's been squeezed is the middle bit. Okay. So there's a bit of polarization going on here. And we also true to say that over half of people in the country believe in God or a higher power or something to some degree or other. Okay. Often not very certainly, and often in a very fluid way. Okay. So you can see there's that there are slightly more people that have that sort of general belief in a higher power than that there are people who say they don't identify with a religion, so they're not religious. So that underlines that belief and identity are different. Now, if we look at things that we as humanists often talk about, if you go into a school, you might talk about belief in God. Another thing which we go on about is one life. This is our one life we have. So I thought it was interesting looking at this. And about 50% of the population definitely or probably don't believe in an afterlife. Obviously, that includes 70% of the non-religious. Interestingly, there's 30% that do. And interestingly, if you look across on this side, on the left side, Anglicans, a lot of Anglicans have the same view, and so do quite a few Catholics. Okay. Where you get, you see this pattern here, the Anglicans closer to the non-religious than the Catholics, and they're closer than the other Christians, and they're closer than the non-Christians. And the biggest chunk of non-Christians, of course, is Muslims. Okay. You can see that the number of people who are not Christian but identify with a religion who don't believe in afterlife is small. It's only 10%. Okay, so again, it underlines you've got to be very careful. Say religious people believe in an afterlife. A lot of them don't, but and there are differences that you can see. Another one we talk about, if you're a school speaker, I usually start with this and say, well, science is a big thing for humanists, and that's why we look for evidence and don't believe in God. There's big differences here. So the question here was about trusting. Do we trust too much in science and not enough in religious faith? Right. And that's very small for both non-religious people, though even there are some non-religious, and Anglicans, not very much difference. Okay. But 45% of the non-Christians religion agree that we trust too much in science and not enough in religion. They either agree or they either agree or strongly agree. So you can see the same pattern we saw before with Anglicans, less than Catholics, less than other Christians, less than non-Christian religious people. So this is about strength of faith, really, and a more fundamentalist look at it, beliefs. And the other one we talk about, of course, is meaning. Where does meaning come from? And we say, well, we bring meaning for ourselves and everything. So this is an interesting question, because the question was, do you agree with this? Life is only meaningful if you provide meaning yourself. So we'd say, most humanists would say, yes, that's true. And what you see here is that the differences are nowhere near as big as you might expect. Okay, generally, in fact, if you say those that agree or agree with that strongly, there are non-Christians agree with that more strongly than non-religious people. So it's not the pattern you would expect, which is interesting, I think, and it just illustrates the fact that you can't see inside the brain of somebody who's answering these questions, because then you ask a different question. Do you agree or disagree? To me, life is meaningful only because God exists, and then you get the same pattern we saw before. Okay, so you've got to be a bit careful with the questions, but this meaning thing is ambiguous, and obviously people know that lots of things bring meaning to their lives. But for religious people, particularly non-Christian religious people, more than half, God is an essential element of that. But it's not actually that big, really. I would have thought it'd been bigger. All right, now the other thing is about tolerance that came out of it. You remember that was a point that they brought out in the report. And one, comforting figure is that only 17% of the people say they think, all things considered, people can't get along with each other that belong to different religions. So that's a minority, a relatively small minority view. And I think that's something which is a good thing for this country. An acid test question that's often asked is, would you accept a person from a different religion or a very different religious view from yours marrying a relative? The different religious view, of course, is important because you might have somebody who's a liberal Jew and they may have you might expect them to have a very negative view of ultra-Orthodox Jews, for instance. And there are cases like that in every faith. And what you can see here, they published the figures only for 10 years ago and more recently, is that the number of people who definitely not accept it has reduced significantly, and so we've become more tolerant. This would indicate. So this, again, encouraging. This picture isn't quite as rosy as you might think there, because there was another report that was done by a group called the Wolf Institute, and this was a more recent report, came out only last November. So Keith hadn't seen this one before. And they were looking at diversity and people's attitudes. And they were saying, well, people now, it's with some exceptions, being racist or xenophobic is generally regarded as being a bad thing in society now. But being prejudiced against people from particular religious faith is more socially acceptable than those other things. They call it the final frontier. And so when you look behind the data I've just shown you, and they did another set of data, which instead of just asking you generally about religion as somebody who's from a different religion, you ask specifically about Islam, you get more concern. Less than half are comfortable with the idea of a close relative marrying a Muslim. Okay. But what's interesting about this is that also in the data, they found that there's generational shifts, and young Muslims, and in particular young Muslim women, are becoming much more assertive about deciding that they have the right to choose who they want to marry. Okay. So this is a very fluid picture and just shows you've got to look behind the detail. The other thing that came out of this Wolf report, which sort of counterbalances the other one, is that people generally are okay with diversity. So you can see in the top one of these pie charts, the question was, is ethnic diversity good for my local community? And the majority of people agreed. And if you include people who were indifferent, it's the big majority. Okay. And similar picture when you have religious diversity. Okay. So some people feel uncomfortable with it, but they're in a minority. What, though, is more problematic is adapting to rapid change. So if you ask people about ethnic diversity in my local community and it's increased too quickly in the past 10 years, then you get a slightly different picture. It's still not bad. It's, you know, people are basically liberally minded, but you know, it's understandable. You know, we all feel everyone has to accommodate to change, and this is what this is about. But the qualitative picture is similar to the data I showed you earlier, that we're basically fairly tolerant, but there's a, you know, 15% people who have difficulty. Now, final thing before we get into some discussion points, I just wanted to talk about was going back to the British Social Attitude Survey. They also looked at questions about free expression and the limits of tolerance. And so they asked people whether they agreed with these things. And people with very strong religious belief are often too intolerant of others. And 65% of people agree that they think that's the case. Okay. Each one of these you have to say, does it say what, you know, they're talking about what they think somebody else thinks. So, you know, it's about what they think somebody else thinks. Question about evangelism, proselytization. Governments should not interfere with the attempts of any religion to spread its faith. Now, this is 39% agree with that. That's a slight challenge to a sort of secular premise, which is free speech. You can say what you like and people can tell you to get lost if they don't like it. But interesting, people. So implied that nearly a third of people think government should interfere. Then there's a question about religious extremists and what they define as a religious extremist. I would say that this is about fundamentalists. Their religion, the only true faith. All other religions should be considered as enemies. Do you think they should be allowed to publish their views on the internet? Nearly 70% of people thought they shouldn't. So this isn't about people saying you should plant, you know, bombs in Manchester Arena. This is about people who have a strong view of their faith. So it does, you know, this is a bit of a test about how far do you want to go with freedom of speech. So as we go into discussion, some questions, you know, you may or may not want to talk about. One is about othering, this awful term othering. You know, I would say as a humanist that you should see anybody you encounter first and foremost as a fellow human being, and then you look at their other identities and come second. And but is there a danger that when you've got both religious dark differences and ethnic differences, that it's more likely that people will regard people who are different as different from them? You know, does that make tolerance more difficult? And tolerance is a pretty low bar. It just means, you know, it can be, you know, I don't like you, but I'll put up with you. You know, do we go beyond that? What about this question about the boundaries of freedom of speech? You know, extremism, how far do you tolerate the intolerant? And then there's this big question about what I call the Church of England gap. You know, you wouldn't know it if you listened to the Church of England, but, you know, you can see the bottom is falling out of it. And that's got huge, huge implications for everybody. You know, what about the physical heritage, all the lovely old, you know, Saxon churches and stuff, music, you know, community, you know, they want somebody religious to talk to, they talk to the Archbishop of Canterbury, rightly or wrongly, but, you know, what's going to happen? And the other one is, of course, nationalists like to hijack Christianity and say that's part of British identity. And so far, that hasn't happened to a big degree, but it is a danger. And you've only got to look at America to see how that can go. And overall question for us, you know, what can humanists do to make all this stuff work? Okay, so that's all I was going to say. And I like that GIF, so I thought I'd stick it in. And so I'm going to stop sharing and we can go into a discussion. So Keith, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. Yes, there was a little bit of new information there, and it's something that's always difficult to have a conversation with. I think with people who are religious views, they like to look, I think, often at maybe limited examples and say, "Oh yes, but there's evidence here that this church here is growing."
Yes,
which it might be in that one small area. It's the wider picture. And as I mentioned before you were able to connect with us, I was talking about the upcoming campaign of Humanists UK to try and get a more accurate reflection in the census of maybe the non-religious, which might help factors. Because you touched on that briefly when you talked about the Church of England and the impact of its lack of numbers and dropping numbers. But you didn't expand on that. And I think that ties in maybe to the census and the role that the Church of England is given because of the official view.
That's was that a yes? Yeah, I'll just quickly comment on that because I want to get some questions. But yes, I mean I didn't mention that I said about the question that the British Social Attitude Survey asked, which is a very specific question, and is very specifically about identity, and it's a two-step question, and that's regarded as a sort of best practice. The census asks a completely rubbish question, and the question they ask is, "What is your religion?" Of course, which is a leading question because it, assumes you must have one. And the result of that is, if you compare the British Social Attitude Survey data for 2011, which is the last census, with the census data, it overstates Anglicanism. Overstates Christianity by half. It's huge difference that brings about, and so it's likely to have a similar, I suspect, probably slightly smaller effect this time, because they, despite lots of lobbying, they haven't changed the question because they first asked it in 2001, and so they've now got 2 data points, and being statisticians, they say we don't want to change the question because otherwise we've lost the trend, because you want at least 3 points. So they haven't changed the question. And but what will be interesting is it's still true that if you look at 2001 versus 2011, given that flawed question, the direction is exactly, the percentage changes are the same as the British Social Attitudes, just starting from a different base.
That's interesting to know, because I've not looked at those figures. I'm just looking at the chat here. There was a comment from Pete, but I don't think any of us are going to disagree with that, really. But people who identify as Christian perhaps need to acknowledge the fact that the church attendance membership has declined and continues to decline. And I don't think there's going to be any, say, disagreement with that. And
they've got a, yes, I think that's a very valid point. And of course, the other thing that's causing them great concern at the moment, the church great concern, is COVID, because the result of that is they've obviously everything's moved online. And although I think most religious groups, because I belong to a couple of interfaith forums, and actually they've had, I remember a Christian talking about this, and also a liberal, the liberal rabbi talking about this. They've had actually a lot more people coming along to their services. But of course, that can be from a huge geographical spread, could be anywhere in the world. And which in one case is a good thing, but in terms of the physical community, they're worried about, particularly when you've got an elderly population, as the Anglicans have, how many of them are actually going to turn up when you reopen physically. It's a big worry.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that the Anglican faith has accepted that it's going to continue to decline, has it? Because they're certainly very keen on introducing more faith schools to get them young, and they're also, I think, going to be emphasising a lot more in those schools that they already have than they have up to now, for the same reason. They're not going to give up on it, certainly.
No, oh no, they haven't given up. I think what's interesting, there was, and if you're interested, I can send you a link to it. There was a very good article a year or so back by, Linda Woodhead. She's a professor of sociology at Lancaster University and sociology of religion. So she's one of the gurus in this area, also herself an Anglican, but very opposed to the Anglican leadership. And somebody else whose name I can't remember wrote it. And the article was provocatively titled "How the Anglicans Swung Brexit." But the end of the article was really its point, which is that what's happening as it shrinks, basically it shrinks because people are dying off. And there's currently a big difference between the evangelical leadership and the more traditionalist people in the pews, and it's the people in the pews that are dying off. So as it shrinks, it's becoming more evangelical, and because of that, and I attended an event a couple of months ago, online event, where the Archbishop of York, it was about the role of the church in social, community work, food banks, all that stuff. And he said, everything, and I remember very clearly, everything, this is a missionary church. Everything we do should have, the view of mission about it. So they see, doing all the social thing, a lot of which is fantastic, of course, and very good. But they see that as a way of getting people in. Whether that'll work out, I don't know. When it comes to your point about schools, absolutely right. My next thing on my to-do list is about a new Church of England school proposed for my area. They are indeed doing that. And I suspect you're right that they'll become more evangelical. But actually, when you consider the number of Church of England schools that there are, and you look at that chart, it isn't working, is it?
No.
David mentioned sorry, I was going to go off at a tangent there. This thing about grabbing them while they're young, that if you study brainwashing, two of the key items are isolation and control of what information they can get from elsewhere, opposing information. And in modern schools, certainly Britain, that's pretty well impossible. They're surrounded by other kids who have other views and aren't interested in religion and so on. And I refer again to that talk, I think it was by someone called David Vose.
Yes.
Why there is no way back for religion in the West. And basically, someone like me who wasn't brought up religious, not anti-religious, just not, it all looked a bit weird. I've been fascinated by it all my life, but it's always looked weird. Perhaps, I mean, if you look at some of the Indian gods, with 10 arms and all the rest of it, it looks quite frightening at times. So increasing skepticism, I think, is inevitable in the young, given education and the internet.
Yeah.
One of your,
I think it's David Vose also who talks about, or it may not be, the Marge Simpson effect, which is going slightly off topic here, where in the 60s and 70s it tended to be the woman who dragged the family to church, Homer and the kids, whereas increasingly in the last 3-4 decades, women have got outside interests. Jobs, they may be the prime wage earner. So again, that Marge Simpson effect has declined.
Yeah. David, you were going to say something?
Jeremy's charts on belief it had a category of people who are not religious but believe in some other power, some supernatural power. I saw somebody earlier said that they think that's an outmoded phrase. I'm not sure that it is, because I think there are many supernatural powers. Is there any breakdown of that in terms of age? Because I've heard, and sadly I can't remember where, that young people do have a propensity to believe in supernatural issues, supernatural crystals, and homeopathy perhaps might come into that realm as well.
Yeah.
More so than they did previously, perhaps because previously they would have been, but now they just want to believe in something.
Yeah. I haven't got those data, but actually what I can do is after this, I'll have a look. Let's just see if that's the case. But I suspect you're right. And I think one of the things that comes over in all of this is it's really messy. It's really messy. Human beings are not consistent, logical, we're all flawed. And there's a big study that's going on called Understanding Unbelief, because sociologists have woken up to the fact, wait a minute, the biggest chunk of people isn't the people we've been studying all the time, it's the people who don't have religion at all. What do they think? And if you ask people who identify as not religious, or maybe say even call themselves atheists or something, people have got all sorts of odd beliefs. And I suspect if you take a bunch of humanists, there'll be a few who think at least the thought as they approach a ladder propped across the pavement, the thought does cross their mind: do I walk under that ladder or not?
Very much from an early age, sadly.
Yeah, we all got that stuff,
Yeah.
Malcolm wants to ask a question. Malcolm.
Yeah, I've got two questions for Jeremy. On slide 10, you said they haven't released all the data. Do you know why?
No, I don't. I don't. It may be that basically the sort of data that I'm not a professional statistician, so it may well be that the data source that I used, which is you can then analyze using Excel spreadsheets and stuff, that there's some data which they've got which is available only in using statistical tools. So I know that the NatSen, they're certainly not hiding anything, but I just couldn't find, there's masses out there, but I just couldn't find all of it.
So it's technological rather than tactical.
Oh yeah. No, I don't. There's no conspiracy here. No, definitely.
And the second was on slide 28. You made the comment about religious extremists, and it's not that they're all bombers or something. I would tend to disagree with you on that. I would think for most people, religious extremism, the first thing that jumps to their mind is 9/11 or jihad and joining the ISIL. I think that's their first impression of religious extremism.
Yes, I mean, I think the full question was: consider religious extremists who believe that their religion is the only true faith and all other religions should be considered as enemies. Yeah, it may be, you're right, that it may be that what this says is, if people react, the image that comes to mind is of an ISIS terrorist or an 9/11 or something, then you would expect that most people to say those people shouldn't share their views. Yes, that's a fair point. It again illustrates what you don't know is what's going through the head of the person who's answering the question. Yeah, so that's a good point.
Yeah, Colette, you wanted to ask?
Yeah, just a couple of things. I actually found that question really quite leading, because there's a difference between considering my own set of beliefs as the only true set of beliefs, and then there's a leap to considering every other set of beliefs as enemies.
Yes.
So that in itself I felt was quite a leading question and might have led to some of the responses that Malcolm's picked up there. So it wasn't a question that I was comfortable with, because I'd working with the students that I'm working with, I've met a lot of students who are very, very sure that their religion, their set of beliefs, their God is the one true God.
Yeah.
But they have also been very open to other understanding other beliefs and other other sets of faith and non-faith, and being very open to sort of discussing and thinking about that. So not necessarily, they may be seen as extremist in the way that they live their life due to their understanding of the religion as being the one true religion. However, that does not necessarily mean that they say other faiths or other beliefs as enemies.
Yeah.
And just there was another point I just wanted to pick up on. I think both David and Brian mentioned it. This notion of brainwashing. Now, I don't know if it's because of the privilege of where I'm working, but I'm not getting the sense that young people are brainwashed. And I think, that sort of, anecdotally, I've no numbers, I've no data for this, Jeremy, but anecdotally, talking to the students, the young people, my own experience of growing up, and I think, that search for meaning means that we will try different things, we will try different aspects. Before I sort of started to identify myself as humanist, I wandered through Wiccan, paganism, Buddhism, and explored quite a lot of belief systems and faiths, which then I think helped me understand where I sat in the world in terms of my beliefs. Now, I was a baptized Catholic, brought up in a moderately religious household, so that searching wasn't a brainwashing. It certainly wasn't to get out of brainwashing. It was about me trying to make some meaning out of my existence. And I think if I was to identify with anything back when I was quite sort of 12, 13, I'd probably have identified as an existential nihilist. So, let's get rid of the whole lot of it. What is this? So that, and I think that is generally my sense of the young people, the students, the people that I'm working with, and the people that I'm talking with, that people are searching for some meaning for themselves, and that'll lead them through what you've described as odd beliefs, but for me are valid.
Yeah.
My point was that it's now, because of the internet, etc., increasingly difficult to isolate people within one framework of belief. It still happens in America, though. If you look up Liberty University, which is a religious college, and they've got a dinosaur skeleton apparently just inside the door that they've labelled as 6,000 years old, which is clearly total nonsense. But sometimes it's this exclusivism can be sort of hidden. As I understand it, it's dogma in the Catholic Church that if you're not Catholic, you can't go to heaven. I.e., everyone else, all other Christians aren't going to go to heaven, only Catholics. And I understand that's official dogma at the Vatican, not amongst Catholics in general, I'm sure, but certainly the top people.
I think, though, yes, what you're saying, Colette, I think is absolutely right, and I think the question you picked up, the thing about I consider their faith is the only true one, or whatever the word, no, just what the word is, believe their religion is the only true faith. I think if that's all it had said, then I would agree with you, because I think most religious people consider theirs as the only true faith. And personally, I think what I think is right, and I think the other people are wrong. And that's okay, because we can accept. Yeah, that's right. But it doesn't. You're talking about people who have an inclusive and liberally minded approach to living in a plural society, and presumably that's great, and young people always, from time immemorial, will search for meaning. I mean, I agree with you that the cases of brainwashing in this country are very, very, very limited to extreme cases. I mean, you might say ultra-Orthodox yeshivas where, or schools run on American evangelical lines, accelerated Christian education schools and that sort of thing. That is designed to do that, but it's very rare. Mainstream schools, I don't think. I agree. I don't think that's true.
Yeah.
Young people
Just a minute, Brian. Yeah. Clive, you wanted to say something earlier.
Well, yes, a comment and a question, really. And I'm particularly interested about limits of toleration or tolerance, and whether, as a humanist, whether I've properly explored this area, and whether I see enough in humanist literature. It's probably there, but I'm missing it, on what these limits could be for a conscientious humanist. So, for example, we've heard about faith schools, and humanists traditionally don't tolerate faith schools, and that's taken as kind of it. And I don't often see the explanation of that unpacked, or any evidence as to the dangerous work that faith schools might do. And then another issue about toleration is, should we as a society, for example, or us as humanists, tolerate halal meat, that sort of practice? Apparently it's legal in this country. Should it be? I mean, I think that's another area. Another area which concerns me when I go to our local faith forum is, how far should we accept that other faiths reject criticism? In other words, if I want to say my point of view, or an individual who's not a religious person wants to express their point of view, it's thought to be unpleasant or damaging to the listener. So these are areas about tolerance that I would like to unpick. Also, the stuff about the established Church of England. We've talked a lot about the Church of England, but not so much about its establishment in the Constitution. And then finally, I don't want to go on to free speech. How much should we tolerate the free speech of others? Now, we talked about extremist talk, and even that is open to question about whether we should censor extremist talk. But I haven't got the answers to these questions, and that's why I'm raising it now, to see whether there's anywhere any thought that's gone into this that might be useful to me and the rest of us.
Well, I think there's a lot there.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Which could do a whole discussion.
Yes.
I'm not taking the last one. Obviously, there was. I don't know if any of you went to a few years ago. There was the thing, a World Humanist Congress in Oxford. Keith, did you get that? It was. You can still get stuff from it. Anyway, that came up with a thing called the Oxford Declaration, and the Oxford Declaration, the subject was about freedom of thought and expression, and that's worth a look at. And I mean, essentially, I think what it says is, the only way you can do it is have the maximum degree of freedom unless you're actually damaging somebody else. Now, so the tolerance thing is an interesting one, and personally, I don't think that it's true that humanists don't tolerate faith schools. I think we just think faith schools are not a good idea, and that's a different thing. I mean, there's lots of things. So, I would never say that people working at faith schools don't do a fantastic job, because if you as a school speaker, you go into a faith school, often they're terrific, really good, and the teachers are good, and but you can disagree with the principle of them, and there are some cases where and why should there be faith schools in a country where most people don't have a faith? And the bit that I personally have a huge problem with is faith-based selection, and I don't think the country should tolerate that, because you shouldn't have a situation where a child is denied a place at a state-funded school because their parents don't have the right, or purport to have the right religion. That seems an infringement of basic fairness. So I'm not sure that's a question of tolerance. But there is the question about how far you tolerate the intolerant is a difficult one. If we take a really troublesome person like, I don't know, Anjan Chowdhury, for instance, whose group, Al-Majah Harun, was behind, a lot of the people that went on to commit terrorist Islamists that committed terrorist acts, had links to that group, even though that group itself didn't advocate. Should he continue to have, now he's out of prison, have freedom of expression? Very difficult. It's very, very difficult. And I don't know.
So
Yeah,
is there anything that I should be reading? Yeah,
Well,
I'm just asking, is there something that I could be looking at that unpacks some of these questions? Those are fabulous answers, Jeremy, and thank you. But what more can I see?
Well, I said the Oxford Declaration just says more or less what I've said, and that's worth, if you just Google that, Oxford Declaration and Humanist International, you'll find that. But some of the humanist philosophers have certainly written about this. If you look up Richard Norman, Julian Baggini, those sorts of people, they've said things about tolerance and freedom of expression. And the other aspect, of course, that touches on is what you mean by secularism. And Andrew Copson's book about secularism, I'd really recommend on that, because that starts off with a definition of what he means, and I think most of us would mean. One element of which is freedom of religion and religion and belief, and which includes practice. So that's also worth looking at. He bases it on a French philosophy, but it's not pure laïcité.
There's a talk, a debate at the Cambridge University with Andrew Copson on disestablishment. Would probably find it though, and he makes the point that the church may not be particularly numerous, 12% now of the population, but they have immense power within Whitehall in terms of lobbying and so on. Yep. It's worth looking that up. But just as one other point, though, we've looked at a lot of statistics, and I know more about the American situation. And in the last 30, it's parallel to the British experience, but perhaps 30 years behind. In the last 30 years, fundamentalist Christianity is down 25%, and mainstream 45% down, and Catholicism 19% down. So the trends are clearly in the same direction as Britain and Europe, but decades behind. And again, it's the young people who are moving out faster. Yeah. But that does explain an awful lot of what's been happening over the last 6 weeks. In terms of, the fundamentalists are just getting very panicky that it's all falling apart.
I think, yes, and it's also, I think, the fact that unless you're a supporter of that political line, a lot of people are turned off fundamentalist Christianity by the extremism of the fundamentalists, because we have got those people here, but they're a tiny number.
I know Matt has a question, but I was just going to comment while we were passing on the schools. Recently, I was looking into it with being now involved a little bit on the local SACRA in Lancashire. That I looked into the schools and the distribution of the schools. And now this doesn't count for the number of pupils in each one. But at a time where, based on the last social attitude survey, roughly 60% of people are not Christian. 60% of the junior schools are allocated to Christians, whether it's Church of England, Catholic, or Methodist, or whatever. It's how we change that. That's one of the challenges, and one of the things I constantly raise as an issue is collective worship. They talk about the fact that you're allowed to take your child out if you opt to do that. But there's no guarantee what they get if they're not there. But equally, I raised the question, well, if the child, as a situation where I was, makes your mind up that you're not a religious person, you don't want to be in that birthing, but your parents aren't taking you out. And it's when do the rights of the child actually start?
Yeah.
Perhaps they should opt in rather than opt out.
The collective worship thing seems nuts. These things are all the historical legacy, and I think that they're not sustainable. I mean, you asked about this establishment. I mean, it's an interesting thing because I think a lot of, I suspect a lot of non-religious people don't really worry too much about whether, the future monarch will be crowned in Westminster Abbey or those things, and probably aren't even aware of the 26 bishops in the House of Lords, and don't, on life's priorities, that's well down the list. So yeah, I can't see though, if you're down to 1% of 18 to 24 years, how is that possibly sustainable? I just don't see. The interesting thing is, of course, there are people in the Church of England who don't like establishment either, because if you're, as it's becoming more evangelical, you may well find yourself up against the government to a greater extent. And the Church of England has, over the past decades, done some things which governments don't like, and that's more difficult if you're an established church. So there are some pressures within the Church of England to disestablish too. I mean, to me, though, the interesting thing for all of us is, so, well, what would we, as part of the non-religious majority, miss if the Church of England wasn't there? And, and how do you avoid the baby being thrown out with the bathwater? And I think there are some things we would miss. And so you've got to think, well, what would you do in its place? But because the Church of England can't accept the fact that they've got this problem, they can't even have that discussion. No.
Okay, Malcolm, you were raising your hand a moment ago.
Yes, you asked at the end of your talk, Jeremy, what can humanists do? I would say humanists, along with other fair-minded people of religion or no religion, can, for one thing, based on your statistics, on the research, is to try and influence the media to acknowledge the level of tolerance in our society. That is one point, I think, fundamentally, where I'm not a great media basher. I think there's good and bad like everything. But that's one point that I think is so important, is that if there is this level, if that is the reality, if there's a level of tolerance that you point out, then the media, I don't think, reflect that fairly.
That's a very fair point. I haven't heard that before, but that is a very fair point. Yeah. And yes, basically because people beating each other up either physically or metaphorically makes news, where people being nice to each other doesn't. And there's a lot going on behind. I mean, you mentioned being on the Sacres and the interfaith forums and all of these sorts of things. People just get on with each other. And after a bit, you get to know people and you quite like them, really. And I like to think that's reciprocated. And it's interesting, by the way, one person that is a very interesting figure that's just popped into the public eye over the past couple of weeks is the newly elected leader of the Muslim Council of Britain.
Oh yeah, a woman.
Zahra Mohammed. Yeah. She's very interesting character because she's 29.
A barrister.
And she did a degree in, and I think it was human rights law that she did a degree in. And completely different to what you're used to. And I think that could shake things up quite a bit, actually. Yeah. And, somebody who is very, although obviously, she's a hijabi woman, and obviously her faith is important to her, but uses humor in a very disarming way, which is always a helpful thing.
You mentioned interfaith forums as well. And the one I'm on has very good relations between the religions. We during World Interfaith Harmony Week, we held a meeting, and Hindu, Sikh, unfortunately not Buddhist, but Thai, Christian, and one other, all got on surprisingly well and had a very coherent message, was that humanity is one, and that just like the Buddha said, I'm in all religions like a thread through a string of pearls. And there's this idea more and more that religious people are beginning to say, not my God is better than yours, but there is only one God. He may have multiple names or attributes, but for theists, there is a gathering body of people who are, I think, more united in their views that there's one God and that he's in all religions.
That's interesting, certainly. And interestingly, there's one religion that actually has that as the official view, which is the Baha'is.
Which I am.
Oh, you? Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah. So many routes.
I try to be. Yeah.
Many routes up the mountain. Yeah. And yeah. So, but could I just ask a question? Just picking that point up, Clive, you mentioned you're on an interfaith forum. You said that there's a difficulty if you're not a religious person or you're a humanist expressing your own views in that. Can you say more about that?
Well, no, that's not the problem. They will listen very politely to humanist views, and they're all nice people, as we've heard. But I feel very restricted in the amount of criticism that I can level at the other members, where I'm open to any criticism that they want to make. They have a sort of protective holy shell round them, and they become rapidly offended at simple, gentle questions, and it's that interface is a problem for me, because I don't think I'm always speaking the truth, and I sometimes cover up my views to protect them, and it's whether we should be doing that or whether we should be exercising our human right to say, well, actually, I think you're wrong. So that's my concern.
Yes, I mean, I think putting on my dialogue hat, I would say that there's different ways of saying things, aren't there? You know, and you know, so you can, instead of saying you're wrong, you can say, well, as I'm a humanist, you probably would expect me not to agree with that, you know. So what I think is so and so, and you're not dissing them. So it's yeah, there are ways you can do that. What we've done I'm on one of the interfaith forums I'm on, which is a new chair who's actually Vicar introduced, and that's really good, is we each time we now have a topic we spend 20 minutes in the meeting talking about, and that topic, like free speech, does bring up differences in views, but because of the framing, that's okay.
Yeah. Well, that's good advice. It needs a good chairman, really, to reconcile these opposing views.
Yeah.
But if we're real humanists, I think we've got to start from the point of view that we are all human, and we've all got our own foibles, and not perhaps to stand on the authority that particularly I've found some Anglican priests come along with, that I'm the bishop of this, or some fancy title that gives them authority that everybody else doesn't share.
Yeah.
So there's an issue there about the sort of power structure. But you're right, that's a good way of dealing with it.
Yeah. Interesting, like that. I'm not sure what you think about this, but I've started now making a point of, I always just, I mean, in an interfaith forum, I think, everybody's on first name terms. So if somebody is the bishop of so and so and their name is Fred, I call them Fred.
That's right.
And mostly people are fine with that.
Yes.
Fine, but it does have a equalizing effect.
Yeah. What they say to me is, I'm very brave to go in the lion's den. Really? And I don't recognize that. I don't think they're lions at all, but they think they are, which I think is very interesting too. It's no problem to me to go into their room and listen to them and talk with them on all these things, because we have the strength that they don't have. We've got the power to be wrong.
Yes.
And that's a wonderful power to have, isn't it?
Yeah.
That they have sacrificed.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think I would be a disaster, I think, on a group like that, because coming from a scientific background, I would want to say to them, look, okay, you say there's a God, give me some evidence. Because faith, by definition, is believing things without evidence. And, you know, there's absolutely no evidence or credible evidence for God. Actually, there's not much for Jesus having existed properly as a real person. You know, and I think I would stir things up rather if I was on a group like that.
In fact, I don't remember ever having a discussion about the existence of God as an interfaith forum. It just doesn't, you know, you're beyond that. I mean, most of it is about, you know, things like, well, you know, how are we going to organize the next, who's going to be the speaker at the next Holocaust Memorial Day event, you know? And I got the one this year. It was a Cambodian guy, a survivor of the genocide, you know, and fantastic to hear him, you know, well, awful as well. And I think it's a lot of it is that sort of stuff. It's practical, how do you, you know, what are we going to do about making sure people get their vaccinations or something, you know, practical things.
Yeah. Just to come back briefly on something that was mentioned in the talk, you know, I think it was interesting that when we were looking at intolerance and the new figures that you brought out as well, but even looking at the old figures from the social attitude survey, whilst it was, and I remember reading this at the time, and it was very much put forward, oh, look what an improvement we've got. But the figures, looking at it from a pessimistic side, still suggests that we've got about 1 in 6 people who are fundamentally intolerant of other people. That's still quite a big number.
Yeah.
Until you get that down to less than 1 in 20, they're going to have a strong influence on the way that other people react to things as well. And I think that then speaks of the other report that you were talking about, the Wolf report, where fundamentally, and this is replicated again very strongly in the media, there's a strong anti-Muslim feeling amongst a lot of people. And I think the hope that we have through interfaith and dialogue and things is that we can kind of dilute some of that a little bit, that, you know, they're not these strangers to be feared, because ultimately I think the core of some of the comments you found in there were that people feel threatened by change, and it's getting them to get beyond that fear that's the challenge.
Yeah, I think absolutely right, Keith. And I think going back to the thing about othering, somebody said earlier on that for a lot of people who are not religious, and particularly if you're a couple of generations away from, you know, your parents and your grandparents weren't religious either, it all seems really weird, you know. You think, well, how could possibly people think that? That's just, that whole dimension of life doesn't you know, resonate with you at all. And there is a danger that then you think of those people, there's something crazy about them and weird, you know. And of course, to me, the way to, you know, deal with that usually is just to meet some people, you know, because very quickly you find that that's not a sustainable point of view. There are some extremists there, and you've got to be careful about that. No question about it. But most people I've met, and particularly people who go to interfaith forums or interested in dialogue, or are mostly people who have a liberal, you know, the small L mindset, and their biggest problems is not with people like us, but it's with their own fundamentalists, who, you know, they have a big battle with.
Yeah. Well, I picked that up when I was involved in some interfaith dialogue about 4 years ago, and the leaders of the group who coordinated and organised it were a couple of Muslim guys, and they were always pulling the hair out of the actions of people who were portrayed as the in the media. They kind of normalised, oh, these are Islamists, and they were like pulling the hair out. They're not Islamists. they're not. They don't represent me. Is what they were feeling.
Yeah.
And when some action took place on the news that maybe there'd been a killing in America that was being picked up, he said first thing they thought is, God, I hope he hasn't got an Asian-sounding name.
Well, you imagine if you're a Muslim, you know, I remember talking to somebody who said, well, particularly when a few years ago when things were even worse than they are now. So, you know, I dread switching on the television because there's going to be, you know, in case there's another one, and somehow I'm somehow responsible for it, you know, and it is very, very difficult. Yeah. Equally, people have other views which we might find very difficult, but I've become very, yeah. So anyway, sorry, I'm rambling here.
No. Malcolm, you.
Yeah, it's an observation and comment at the same time. It's interesting, out of recent meetings that I've attended, whether there be PIPs or these 2 weekend meetings from yourselves, there's been more male than female. And I think maybe women, maybe even without realizing it, men tend to talk more in terms of ideals, theory, and so on. And women who, as you pointed out in your slide, Jeremy, are more attenders than men. Maybe women are more interested in spirituality, in family, in relationships than we are. And I wonder whether men are dominating the dialogues at the moment. I don't know what your experience of your interfaith meetings is, Jeremy, but do you think there are too many men involved, and do we not give women enough backup to take part? I mean, as you mentioned, I'm a Baha'i, and one of my sort of strap lines is "Women are the key to peace."
Yeah.
When their voice is heard, all war will cease. You know, so perhaps men are still exerting their dominance in subtle ways.
Interesting you say that. I think actually that may be more of a problem, dare I say it, in humanist groups. And I suspect you're right. These are terrible generalizations, and of course, but that on average, men may be attracted. Some men are more attracted to intellectual discussions of the type we're having now than some women are. In the thinking about the 2 interfaith forums I'm on, one of them probably may have slightly more men than women, but the other one is co-chaired by two women, and I think men are in the minority on that. But you're right. When you try and intellectualize it, it does tend to head into a male direction. Whether that's generational, I don't know.
The actual membership of Humanists UK isn't as biased in this direction, is it?
No, it's not.
Taking part in, as you say, Jeremy.
Yeah, no. The membership of Humanists UK is, you know, roughly in line with what you'd expect of the non-religious population in the country. So yeah, not a huge difference.
And does it translate into activity? I mean, belief and practice. Are those women to the fore in the humanist movement?
Depends where you look. If you look at things like ceremonies, celebrants and things, I say definitely yes. And pastoral support, that's another area where I've never seen, if anything, more women than men in those things, I think. So it depends on the type of activity. And if you look at the current board of trustees, yeah, that's the chair is a woman. I think, well, at least, yeah, I mean, I think it's about 50-50 in terms of gender balance, and actually quite a reasonable ethnic balance on that as well. So yeah, I think it depends what sort of activity you're in.
Yeah. To bring it back to the talk, you did mention that right at the beginning about the ethnic and gender differences, not just in religion, but I think amongst humanists. And I think we've talked about this before, that the majority of humanists who seem to come along to meetings tend to be white male, middle class, middle age plus. We don't get enough younger people, and only the occasional representation from someone who's maybe an ethnic minority. I think to the point you touched on earlier, that to get where they are is extremely hard, coming from the cultural background that they've come from to get here. So maybe that will change in time. We'll hopefully see that. I found it useful today, you know, reinforcing maybe things that I didn't pick up on previously, things like the big city effect, and that our community that we live in doesn't necessarily match another community. And I found it quite interesting just the other day, looking at the distribution of humanist groups across the UK. Once you get north of us, there's not much before you get to Edinburgh, and that's about it. There's one up in the northeast, and that's the north of England. There's a lot more in the south in groups active.
Yeah.
So maybe there's a geographical divide as well. So who knows what's going on in Yorkshire?
Well, there are a couple of groups in Yorkshire. Yeah, there's so yeah, but yes, I'd need to look at the map. I don't know. And the northeast is actually quite a big active group. But you're probably right. I mean, the biggest group, don't know if that's changed, used to be the Central London one. But
okay, well, I think we're wrapping up because Clive needs to leave. I think we've managed to get through an awful lot. So thanks, Jeremy, for the presentation today. I think it's been really good. The recording, I'll try and make it available for, I know one or two people who said they couldn't make it, so we'll do what we can to make it available. And yeah, let's see how we go on. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.
And I do apologise for keeping you waiting at the beginning. And next time I have to use this, I now know how to, well, I know the trick around the camera problem.
Right, okay.
And in case anyone wants to know it,